Today we're doing Lockdown by Simon Armitage. This here is Simon Armitage. He was born in West Yorkshire, he was unemployed for a bit, worked as a probation officer in Manchester, and now he's Poet Laureate of the UK, so it all turned out okay for Simon. Why does his poem matter? It's a poem about finding social contact even if we're physically isolated, and freedom of the mind even during lockdown, and that in itself is a kind of consolation. Ultimately, it's about a narrator who can't get to sleep. He's having a nightmare about plague, and eventually he thinks of something that eases him off to sleep. Let me read it first. Lockdown. And I couldn't escape the waking dream of infected fleas in the warp and weft of soggy cloth by the tailor's hearth in ye olde Eam. Then couldn't unsee the boundary stone, that cockeyed dice with its 6 dark holes, thimbles brimming with vinegar wine, purging the plagued coins, which brought to mind the sorry story of Emmett Siddle and Roland Tor, star-crossed lovers on either side of the quarantine line, whose wordless courtship spanned the river till she came no longer, but slept again, and dreamt this time of the exiled Yakshas sending word to his lost wife on a passing cloud, a cloud that followed an earthly map of camel trails and cattle tracks, streams like necklaces, fan-tailed peacocks, painted elephants, embroidered bedspreads of meadows and hedges, bamboo forests and snow-hatted peaks, waterfalls, creeks, the hieroglyphs of wide-winged cranes and the glistening lotus flower after rain, the air hypnotically see-through, rare, the journey a ponderous one at times, long and slow, but necessarily so. First, a bit of context. Context is so key to this poem. I've divided the bits of context you need to know into two by this word but. Above the word but, the narrator can't get to sleep. Below the word but, he's beginning to fall asleep. And above the word but, we get the bubonic plague in Eam. So when we're referencing the warp and the weft of the soggy cloth, that's a bale of cloth from London which brought fleas carrying the plague to the village of Eam in the late 17th century. So the village self-isolated, they contained the spread of the plague, but unfortunately a quarter of the village died. This boundary stone is where villagers would put money into holes on the stone to pay for provisions, so food, water, clothes, and they would even put vinegar wine to cleanse the plagued coins. Linked with this is the love story of Emmett Siddle and Roland Tor, the star-crossed lovers like Romeo and Juliet. Basically, they're living in Eam. Emmett Siddle, her father and siblings are among the first victims of the plague. So they agree that when they meet, they're going to meet at a distance. They're going to social distance, in effect. But the distance is so great that eventually the courtship is wordless. And they just go to a place and basically just see each other. And then one day Emmett Siddle doesn't turn up, Roland gets worried, and eventually learns that she died of the plague. So he's being haunted by this. Then he thinks of the exiled Yakshas sending word to his lost wife on a passing cloud, and that makes him fall asleep. What's this Yaksha business about? Basically, this is from the Meghaduta, which is one of the greatest Sanskrit poems of all time. It literally means passing cloud. And Yaksha means subject in Sanskrit. He's the subject of King Kubera, the lord of all wealth, and he's exiled to central India for neglecting his duties. But he convinces a cloud to send a message to his wife while he's away by telling the cloud all the great things that the cloud is going to pass over. So that's the hedges and the meadows and the peacocks. Ultimately, he finds social contacts, or rather the poet enables social contact between his characters by imagination. I mean, a cloud can't send a message, it's not reality, but it's imagination. We'll get onto that more. I think my favourite thing about this poem, though, is the slant rhyme. What do I mean by slant rhyme? Slant rhyme is a kind of half rhyme. It doesn't completely work. So, for example, dream and fleas. There's one consonant that's off. If that S was an M, it would work, but it's not quite there. Similarly, in cloth and hearth, it's not the consonant, but actually the vowel that doesn't work. The hearth and the cloth, then we get, as we go on, I mean, all of these are slant rhymes. Story, tour, sideline, river longer, again, time, word, cloud, map, tracks, necklaces, elephants, bedspreads, hedges, peaks, creeks. That's our first exact rhyme. We're kind of beginning to get some kind of resolution. Then we go back to half rhyme, cranes, rain, because there's no S there. And then we go back to full rhyme, air, rare, slow, but necessarily so. Why does he resolve the rhyme? I think it's got something to do with the narrator falling off to sleep. There's a kind of peace of mind that's introduced by the fullness of the rhyme. And ultimately, he finds peace of mind through literature, through the Meghaduta, through a Sanskrit poem. That's what he thinks of. And I really like this ending. It's slow, but it's necessarily so. That's the resolution. In contrast to The Moon by Shelley, which we looked at earlier, which ends with the joyless eye that finds no object worth its constancy. Here we have an object worth our constancy. It's a long journey, but it's necessarily so. We trust that there's a purpose and there's an end where we can see our loved ones again. Finally, this idea of sending messages in nature. So there's the word of the passing cloud and the hieroglyphs of wide-winged cranes. It's almost as if the narrator or the poet is seeing language in nature, is finding inspiration in nature. So if we remember Shelley's aim as a poet, he wanted the reader to love and admire and trust and hope and endure. Well, Armitage has got his own version of that. He wants the reader to focus and think and be contemplative. And if poetry is about contemplation and imagination, and if, as we just mentioned before, the imagination can be consoling, then, as Armitage likes to say, poetry is by definition a kind of consolation.